Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Streaming Alchemy. I'm John Mahoney, and on today's show, we're going to take a look at an underutilized input in vMix called the mix input. This is actually a very powerful tool for a lot of things you may want to do in your productions. But before we get into that, I invite everybody, please, if you have any feedback, any questions, any suggestions, just enter them in the comments below. Or if you'd like to join us here on the show, live on air, you can connect to the link we have, which we'll put up in a second, that will let you come in remotely, and somebody from the studio will get you on air with us. So thank you all for joining me again. The One of the things that, as we were looking at different capabilities in vMix to explore, one of the ones that a lot of people are kind of aware of, but really aren't using that much, uh, ended up being the mix input. So the mix input is basically a mini switcher or sub switcher. It has a preview and a program out, and it lets you switch between those two sources as the output of that input. So a lot of capability in that. Uh, but one of the things that this mix input lets you do is overcome some of the limitations in vMix when it comes to working with sources and layers, masks, other things. And we'll get into that. But I wanted to just really touch first on what the mix input itself looks like. So if I switch over to the input here, what I've done is I've added a mix input here that, as you can see, looks very different from other traditional inputs. It has a preview and a program, an output, and I can select any sources I want for the preview and the program. So one of the things you'll see here is the output I have. So if we jump up to the full screen here, the output over here is the output of this mix input. So I can fade between these two elements in the mix input. I could also just select a different preview. And again, the full types of controls that you would have available with a mix is now available with these mix inputs. So let's talk about a couple of real use cases. The first one would be, say you had a production going on that's like a sporting event, and you needed to broadcast it in multiple languages, and you wanted everybody to see the coverage of the event itself using the same feed. But when you would cut away to on-air talent, somebody that could be, the play-by-play caller or other color commentary, you needed to actually have a different input for each one of the languages because somebody would be talking and potentially engaging with an audience. So one of the ways that you could use these mix inputs would be to sync them up with the main input when you wanted to have the actual event being broadcast, but then break that link and have it cut over to a particular commentator when you wanted to have that piece of the production go on. So, oh, before I get into that, I see we've had a number of people joining. So we have Rudy, thank you very much for joining again, Rudy. Always great to see you. Jawad, thanks for joining us from Sweden. And we also have John Simon from Montreal. So thank you all for dropping in and saying hello. So that's great. So if we wanted to, what we could do is we could write a very simple script, which just coincidentally I have done, to sync up the main output, the main mix that we have in vMix, with the secondary mix we have set up here. So if we just look at this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the two mixes, set them up, say what's the input on the main mix, which is mix 1, and then I'll blank out the input for mix 4, which is the one we're switching here. And I do the normal stuff we usually do here. I go in and I load the declare vmix.xml as an XML document, and I load that in, so I get the status of everything coming in inside of vMix. And then all I'm doing is I'm selecting the node, the actual node for what's active, what is the active input, taking that into text, so that sets up what is input 1 for what's the input being displayed on mix 1. And then if it's not the same as the input on mix 4, I simply go and I cut it over to that. So I'm taking whatever's on mix 1 and setting that to the input on mix 3. And then I set on mix 4. Okay, the reason I said 3 was because vMix has something very confusing going on here. It's zero basing the programming indexing, but in other parts of the script, it calls it as mix 4. So it's mix 0 to mix 3 in the script, but it's mix 1 to mix 4 everywhere else. So it can be a little confusing. But so mix 3 is actually mix 4 everywhere else should see it. And so then I set the input from the main input, the main program output, and I set that to the mix program output, and I stop. Now, a couple of things here that we're doing a little differently. I am actually just running this now continuously in the background. So I have a while true and an end while. So this whole piece of code here iteratively gets run in the background with a quarter of a second pause. So anytime something changes on the main program out, within a quarter of a second, that change will be reflected on the mix out that we're using for this second language broadcast. And the other thing to note in here is that inside this loop, I am continuing to pull the select the single node from the vMix XML. And that's important because even though you would pull it once, when you're in this loop, that would just maintain that old value. So you have to actively, in each loop, go and refetch what's the current output, what's the current input being sent out of the program out in vMix. So that's really it. We have this set up as a script, and then what I will do is when we want to cut away to our own camera, we can just tell that script to stop, and then when we want to sync up with the main vMix feed, we can tell them to snap back in. So let me show how that is done. So right over here, what we have is the output of mix 1. So let me just switch over and I'll send another output over here. So say this was the main program coming out of vMix, and this is the output we have over here as our mix 4 output. So right now I can switch around and nothing happens. But if I put mirroring on, so I have this as a button on my Stream Deck, if I put mirroring on, now when I make changes in the main output, they are reflected in this mix output. But at any point, if I wanted to drop out, I can click mirror off right over here, and then this will switch on its own again. So it is a very simple way to have these kinds of submixes, which may have nothing in common. It may be something you switch entirely on its own, or it could be a mix that you're pulling off the main mix and then switching away from to leverage. So lots of different ways to do this and lots of different reasons you may want to create these submixes, but that is what you have fundamentally with these mix inputs. So we've had a few more people join us. So we have James Redmond. James, thank you for joining. We have, I want to make sure I'm not butchering your name, Srikant. So thank you for joining us from India. It's always great to have people from around the globe be part of our community here. And we also have Sisay. So Sisay, thank you very much for joining. So let's take a look now at some of the other things that you can be doing with these mix inputs that are probably a little bit different. So the first one I want to talk about is something to do with masks. So let me switch over here. So if you remember, we did a show a couple of weeks ago. Gosh, it probably is even longer than that. It's probably over a month ago, uh, focusing specifically on use cases for masks inside of vMix. So if you remember, what we would do when we have a mask is you would go into the color key, and down here in the key fill input, you would select an input that you'd want to use for a mask. Now, I'm just going to select this mask highlight here. And as you'll see up here, what it's done is it has this nice circle that's sitting right over here in front of the chef's face, and it is giving that sort of highlight that we want. But what you'll notice, so that's this input right here. What you'll notice though is if I go into this input and I try to zoom in, or I try to pan or position, nothing is happening over here. So what we actually have in this case is when that mask is applied, it is mapped one-to-one with the input that it's masking. So this means that no matter what I do with the mask input itself, it's the masking feature inside of vMix is really ignoring that. And what it's doing is it's basically letting me sit there and say, you can do that all you want. I'm just keeping this one-to-one mask in place. So what if, though, we wanted to do something different with this? So this is where we could actually use a mix input as a mask. So let me go back in here to the layers, to the mask. And instead of selecting the mask directly, I'm going to go and select this mix I have for the masks. So with this mix now in place, that is, I'm using this mix as my mask for this. So right now, the mix is set to white. So I could just cut to zoom in, but that's something I could do with scripting or shortcuts to just change what the mask input is on that input. The other thing, which would be a little more difficult, is I can fade it in. But probably the most interesting thing I could do is actually I could control where the mask is on the image. So let me talk about how we would do that. Inside the mask, one of the things that I've done here is I've set up a virtual input. And what a virtual input will let you do inside of vMix is I can take a big image and I can pan around in that big image to basically sort of zoom in and highlight areas of interest. And if I do this, so I set this up as a virtual PTZ, what I can then do is I can tie that PTZ to a joystick I have over here, just an X keys joystick that now allows me, if I turn the mask on, I can now move this mask around. So if I wanted to jump in and highlight different things over here, I want to look at what the chef's doing down here, I can just position around. And so this now, just using this mask, I have the ability with a joystick to create a moving mask. And this is something you could do with a video. So if I set the mask to a video and I moved the white element around, which is the transparent piece, inside the video, you'd see that move. But to do that with a static image is not possible without using the mix inputs as a proxy. And that's because when that relationship is established, the mix input, the output from that mix input, sort of mapped one-to-one as the mask for the input it's masking. But what's being fed out that one-to-one mapping can change and be dynamic. So this now allows me to do these types of things where I can set and move the mask around simply by using virtual PTZ. And what we did for that is we zoom in. So we have this set up at 1.5 resolution. So it's sort of zoomed in a bit, and then I pan and tilt around through that. And it's not the focus of this, but if I set this up in shortcuts, you'll see that in shortcuts there's a whole joystick section. And the way I set this up was I have all of the PTZ controls set up. The joystick controls map to the PTZ controls inside of vMix. And I'm applying them to a dynamic input. So if I wanted to change the input I was using that on, I can just bounce it around from input to input, and that would work fine. So if I had different shape masks or different things I wanted to do, all that would work. And so it becomes something that's very simple to do now, where before it wasn't possible. And so I can just now turn this on and off, and you see you get a nice smooth fade in and out. Again, something that would have taken a lot more effort to do with static masks. So that's definitely one use case. The other, though, is something that I've heard from a lot of people out there, and that is when you get remote guests that come in and you put them in multi-boxes and they're not really lined up. So what's the issue? So this is fine. So if I have somebody here, let me just pick this person. This person is nicely centered. So when you cut them up and put them in a box over here, it works great and the framing is nice. But what if I have a guest coming in like this? What ends up happening is you can try to get them to do it, but lots of times during a show, they'll lean to the side and you'll have this sort of drift that they'll have. How do you deal with that? Well, what you get right now is you get something like this, which is not a great shot. And if I actually look at the usual cases, let me look at the layers in here. Oh. So what I would do first is let me just take and put this person in here and say, what are the usual cases for what people first do? So what I'd first do is my reaction would be, let me go in here and I'll try to change the positioning for this person. So here's this and I'm sliding this over. But what's happening now is when you put this into a layer, it again sort of syncs these up. So when I'm positioning the person, I am now repositioning the layer. So let me reset this. So what can we do here? There are two options. One is you could use a virtual PTZ, so that would work, except the only way the virtual PTZ works is if I zoom in. So I don't have the ability to do sort of a virtual PTZ with half a zoom, and I can't just pan in the existing image. So this means that with the virtual PTZ, I'm sort of frozen with this. But if I come in here and as opposed to using the guest off-centered, the original guest image, I actually use a mix input. I now have the ability, so if I come in here now and I go back and do, let's play with the positioning, I now can slide this person into place and create a nice framing. The other option I have, if I don't want to actually go in and do all these steps, is I can tie this into a stream deck. So right across here, I have little nudges. So this will nudge me to the left, and this will nudge me over here to the right. So that gives me the ability to sort of, if I start from 0, I can just move the person over little bits. And if I wanted to move them back, the same thing. So what you see here is when I do this nudging, you can see that I'm getting black space. I'm actually moving the image. But because this is the input to my mix input, that one-to-one mapping, again, still stays the same in the layers, but when I slide the guests back and forth, they now slide and fit into the box correctly. And because you have multiple mix inputs, and in fact there are 4, in vMix parlance, there are 4 actual mixes you have. Mix 1, which in all your code would be mix 0. So mix 1, which is the standard vMix output, that's assigned by default. And you'll see that all the time as sort of your preview as your standard preview and program outputs. Then you have three other mix inputs. So these other mix inputs will come in, and again, you can enter a mix input down here. And that is the only way you can add a mix input, but you're limited to just three more. So my assumption is it's fairly compute intensive to have a mix input, so they have this limitation. But with those mix inputs, you can overcome a lot of issues. So with three mix inputs, I could have three guests on here and be able to position all of them. And even though I set this up using an X keys with little sort of nudge buttons on it, I'm sure that with a little more programming work, I could do something where I tie it into a dial or a slider. So that could be something that visually you could probably take care of very quickly and even very smoothly. It could be something where, as opposed to jumps the way I had it, it could be something where you just almost do like a camera follow with the person. So I think there are lots of good ways to potentially do this. But this is just something that I know a lot of people have talked about as being an issue when they are bringing in guests, and mix inputs are a way you can solve that. So this is everything that I wanted to cover here in the show. Just as you think of this, though I've set up certain things here, this is probably not the limit of what you can do. So I definitely would be interested in hearing what some of you may actually come up with in different use cases. Because I think the more we share this and sort of look at different ways to overcome some of the limitations in the gear we already have in place and are using, this is going to be something where people will invent and refine on what we share with each other. So definitely something that I think as a community, we can start to develop our skills collectively and in an interesting way here. So we will be hanging around after the show. So if you have any other questions or any other comments that you'd like to share, please, the post show would be a great time to do it. Also, if you want to still join us on air and have a live conversation, again, please, this will stay open for the whole show. So we'd love to have you join us that way as well. So if I don't see you in the post show, thank you all for joining, and we'll see you again next week. Take care, everyone. All right, welcome back, everybody. So this was one of those shows that came together in an interesting way. I was looking at different things in vMix that I thought people might be interested in learning about, and at that point, somebody had asked me specifically about positioning guests inside of a layered, a multi-box through vMix layers, and I was like, oh, you can use the mix input for this. And then I thought there were other use cases here, I'm sure. And I said, this would probably make a good show. So it came about from sort of real world, somebody trying to solve a problem for themselves. And these are the types of things where once you start to use a tool, you'll think of all the other applications you have for it. And so I'm hoping that these mixing inputs could be that for a lot of you as well. So let me see who else we have. So Rudy, thanks. Yeah, I mean, we thought the use cases were interesting. They may not be completely applicable, but hopefully the tools we talked about inside of them would be things that people would be able to apply. So we also have Saul from Panama. Saul, thanks for joining us here. We have Oliver Communications. Oliver Communications, thank you for stopping in here. And we have Siquiero Streaming. So Siquiero is saying mix outputs will be game changers. Yeah, I mean, I think there are lots of different applications for them. And especially in those cases where you've been frustrated by how vMix handles some of these things like in mass or in layers, where it's not working necessarily intuitively to you. So I know the folks at vMix are constantly refining things. So these are things that will probably be addressed, or different ways of handling them will be addressed over time. But until then, it's good to have these types of workarounds. So uh, Srikant said, what if I'm out of mix inputs? Is there any other way to achieve the positioning? The interesting question, because I haven't tested this, but if I had to think of a way, uh, it would be to route video out of one of the vMix outputs and then bring that in as an NDI feed. So if you were just using output one for your main production stream, I could see sending, like having three inputs for guests, sending them as outputs 2, 3, and 4, bringing outputs 2, 3, and 4 in, and putting those as layers in a multi-box. I believe that would do effectively the same thing as the mix outputs, where you have that sort of proxy in between. So you're using an NDI input, but what's in that NDI input could then change this way. So that would definitely be something. Actually, I mean, I always in the after show, it's always good to be able to do things. So let's take a look and see if that would actually work. So if let's go. I want my output, and I'm going to say output. Say output 4 is going to be guest 7. He's my okay. So now that I'm doing that, and that's going out, so I'm going to add an NDI input. So this is live. So if this blows up terribly, you'll you'll have to just chalk this up to being live here. So let's see. This is vMix output 4. I think this is probably okay. So here is this person here in vMix output 4, and I'm going to go into the layers, and I'm going to set this to input 20. Okay, so now we'll give this a shot. So if I have positioning here, no, that still isn't working. So unfortunately, that isn't doing what I wanted it to do. But if okay, so that was because I was doing the wrong thing. So if I go up here to the original, so let me go and just reset this. So yes, so that does look like this would work. So if I reset this and I push him back to 0, now if I just went into the original input and slid around, so that will work the way you want. So hopefully, so the issue with Srikant is saying, could you use a virtual input? You could, but the issue with the virtual input would be you'd have to zoom in to be able to pan around. So if I just go back here and we'll put this in to the layers, number 7. Okay, so if I actually set this up and said, let's create a virtual input, and he's created an input at this location. Okay, so I have number 21. So we'll give this a shot. Go to the layers again, and this will be number 21. Okay, so what we potentially could do if I go in here and I do the PTZ controls. Yes, so when I do the controls, you don't get anything because I'm zoomed all the way out. So I believe now if I zoomed in, this would work. But the issue is you have to be zoomed in. And for a lot of things with remote guest, you don't have that as an option. First, you're not necessarily dealing with a lot of resolution. And usually the framing is very close for most people if they're on a laptop or a desktop webcam. So you don't necessarily have that. If you did, that would be something you could do. Uh, and it would basically give you, something very similar to what we have in Live Theater, where you can zoom in and pan around to reposition people. But that's not something that you always have as an option. So being able to just slide people around could be a very useful way to do this. But that was definitely a very good suggestion because this would work. And in fact, let me see. I'll show this. We had another demo in here that we did, which sort of combined the first two, where I have a map which is zoomed in, and I am moving around inside that map as a virtual input. So this would be another use case where if I wanted to do that, you could make this type of thing work. So there are different ways you can work with virtual inputs to solve some of these issues, if it's not a remote guest, but other things that lend themselves to this. But that's what you get if you want to do something with zooming in. That would probably be it. So, but yeah, I mean, I think with a lot of these things, you're going to end up with having very specific cases you can apply them to because they are a limited resource. So your mix inputs, you only have 3 plus the original. Same with the outputs. You have your main output plus 3 additional. So between those 2 mechanisms, there may be ways to make this work the way you want. But it is always frustrating when you use scarce resources, because I know it's the same thing in the TriCaster when you run out of mix effects buses, and you're always trying to sit there and go, okay, how do I get around this? How else can I split this up? So one of the things the TriCaster has, it lets you sort of load things in as sets. So I can turn around and say, how do I have ME1 configured? Well, I can have 5 different configurations, and I just pick the one I want. So that can make it helpful, gives you sort of extends it. But if you need multiple things together, you do have to deal with the limitations that the software or the hardware have. So are there any other questions or any other comments, or would anybody like to join with us here? So one of the other things, while I wait for your feedback, one of the other things that I didn't talk about in the show was this is the first time I've actually used a script running full-time in the background. And the impact did not seem to be terrible. It didn't really overload the system. And the way I stopped it is there's just a script start and a script stop. And so I just use that as a button to start and stop it. But it's something that definitely is it seems much more doable. So I have to explore that a bit more as we go on. So let's see, James asked a question here. So when I go back to live hybrid events, what I see needing is when I take a question from a remote audience, I'd want to have just that person image going to a projector. So when you take a question from a remote audience, so based on how you do that, if you have everybody coming in as individual inputs, that would be something that you could certainly do with a script or a shortcut to sort of push that through, and just say I have my main program output, but I opt for a screen that I may want to have or some type of IMAG inside the venue that could be coming out of another feed and fed out that way. So that could be done pretty straightforward with a simple script or shortcuts. It is, if you're doing something with Zoom, that would be probably something where you'd have to pin somebody, where when you have somebody that's raised their hand and you're having them answer a question, you'd have that set up as pinnable and be pulling that out through a scan converter to put that out. So not always optimal, but definitely something that can work. Inside of any one of the remote feeds you can get, this would be something where you'd have to really figure it out from a workflow point of view. How are you getting this person in? Is it something where you only have a matrix of people coming in, sort of, 5 people across by 5 people down, and you have to do some sort of masks for that? So that's another option you'd have is, potentially a mask and a Zoom to go in. So potentially a couple of different ways to do that. If we had more, uh, if you want to share more details about how you have that set up, I'd be happy to dive into that deeper here. So we also have Gunnar, just said, good evening. Gunnar, thank you for joining us. So I'm I'm assuming you're coming to us from Europe somewhere where it is evening over there. So thank you for making us part of your Friday evening. That's we're really honored that you're willing to share your evening time with us. So thank you. Everybody appreciates that here. So let's see. So, oh, Gunnar, so from Sweden. So thank you. So there's you know, what I love is that the community has people from so many different places globally. And it's amazing when there's a topic that people are joined to, how that can become a great bond that transcends a lot of other boundaries and differences. So this is always great. So so Siqueiro Streaming says they're from Barcelona. That's great. So Gary, thanks. Gary just comment that he enjoys the creativity. I mean, I think a lot of ideas, and I think this is true for probably all of us. Uh, they come from people asking us really cool questions, ones that we have to scratch our head about, and that encourages us to design new things, to look for creative solutions. And so this is the importance of having that sort of community where people not just have answers but have great questions. And when you have those great questions, good things come of that. So Guy, thanks for joining us. Guy is a vMix scripting guru and has been really contributing to the vMix community around scripting for quite a while. So I'm sure everybody that has been looking at scripting owes Guy a big thank you, whether we're aware of it or not. But he's probably set up a lot of the initial groundwork in making scripting more accessible. So thank you. So Richard just joined us. Richard, you missed a few things. so, uh, but we really we talked about using the mix inputs as in vMix in a couple of different ways, using them as a proxy into masking, so you could do dynamic masks, and we talked about using them as a proxy for a video source and a layer that you could then align. So when you have remote guests that may not be lined up well for a multi-box shot, you have the ability to nudge them around. So we covered both those things and a few others. So hopefully, hopefully you'll get to catch us on the replay here. So yeah, I mean, to echo, I mean, Richard just mentioned, Guy is the key. Absolutely, Guy definitely is a groundbreaker in this space. So we collectively owe him a debt. So Samuel, thank you for joining us from Norway. So that is great. So so as I mentioned, a lot of ideas for shows, for things we do in productions, come from people asking questions. So if there are things that people have been asking you, or things that you think would make for an interesting topic to cover, it doesn't have to be vMix related. They can be, very broad. I mean, we've got a lot of TriCaster experience here, some general production experience, IP-based production experience. So there's probably different topics that we'd be very open to covering and think we could do a decent job with. So please, we're always interested in new topics for shows, especially ones that especially ones that are very relevant to things that you need to do now. So, oh, so I guess Guy is I said Guy's name wrong. So Guy, I apologize because it's not Guy, it's Guy. So my my sincere apologies for that. It's always difficult when you've only met virtually online. So thank you for correcting that. I'll try to be more aware when I say that in the future. But that's great. So so again, so anything you want to share, that would be very much appreciated. But if we have any other questions here, I'm guessing not. So on that, oh, so so Guy said no worries. He responds to both and he's used to it. But I do want to work at getting people's names correct. So thank you. So if we're covered everything here for the post show, we'll wrap this up, and I will see everybody next Friday at the next Streaming Alchemy show. And we have some interesting ideas for that show. So we hope you'll take the time to join us. So thank you, everybody. Take care. See you next week.